I was looking at a ghost, a very pregnant, very terrified ghost, holding a plastic tray of dirty coffee cups. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon, and I was 300 miles away from my quiet home in suburban Chicago, sitting in a run-down roadside diner that smelled like old bacon grease and burnt coffee. I had only stopped to get a glass of ice water and rest my aching bones. I did not expect to come face to face with the woman my son claimed had ruined his life and vanished forever. She did not recognize me at first. She was just staring blankly ahead, looking completely exhausted as she walked toward my booth. But when she finally looked down and our eyes met, the color completely drained from her face. She let out a sharp, choked gasp. The heavy tray slipped from her trembling hands. The deafening crash of shattered glass and thick ceramic mugs hit the linoleum floor, echoing loudly through the silent diner. The few truckers sitting at the counter turned their heads to look, but I could not move. I was entirely paralyzed. Standing in front of me, shaking like a cornered animal, was Emily, my daughter-in-law. Before I could even breathe her name, she lunged forward. She grabbed my calloused hand with fingers as cold as ice, her fingernails digging painfully into my skin. She leaned across the wet table, tears instantly spilling over her pale cheeks. "Please, William," she whispered in a voice so broken it barely sounded human. "Please do not tell him I am alive. If Jason finds out I am here, he will kill me. He will kill us both. If you are just starting to listen to this story right now, I need you to take a deep breath. Because what I am about to tell you is a dark, twisted nightmare I never imagined could happen within my own bloodline. If you have ever been completely betrayed by someone you trusted with your entire soul, please hit the like button. To help this old man feel a little less alone, subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the rest of my story. And please tell me in the comments where you are watching this video from and what time it is there right now. It brings me comfort to know which corner of the country or the world is listening to me today and what time of day it is for you. Let me take you back to that exact moment in the diner because my brain simply short-circuited. For 7 agonizing months, I had watched my son Jason play the role of the devastated, abandoned, heartbroken husband. I had held him in my arms in my living room while he sobbed uncontrollably. He told me Emily was a manipulative gold digger. He claimed she had ruthlessly emptied his company bank accounts, stolen everything he had spent years building, and run off into the night with another man. I had believed every single word my son said. I am 70 years old. My name is William Stanton. I spent 40 years of my life working as a general contractor, destroying my back and my knees, breathing in sawdust and dirt to build a comfortable, secure life for my family. When Jason came to me crying about his ruined business, I did not hesitate for a single second. I quietly liquidated my retirement bonds. I handed my only son $200,000 in cash to save his private equity firm from going entirely bankrupt. I did it because I loved him, because a father protects his children no matter the cost. But the young woman standing in front of me, gripping my hand in absolute terror, was not a wealthy thief. She did not look like a woman who had run off with a secret lover and a stolen fortune. She was wearing a faded, stained waitress uniform. Her eyes were sunken with dark, heavy circles of sheer exhaustion. She looked starved, hiding in the shadows of a forgotten, miserable town. And beneath her dirty apron, she was heavily pregnant with a child I did not even know existed. My grandchild. The diner manager suddenly yelled from behind the greasy counter, asking Emily if she was going to clean up the mess or just stand there crying all day. Emily flinched violently at the sound of his rough voice, her shoulders hunching defensively. I could see the profound, deep-rooted fear radiating from her very bones. I slowly pulled my hand free from hers. I reached into my worn leather wallet and threw a crisp $20 bill on the wet table to cover the broken glass. I looked the manager dead in the eye and told him we were stepping outside for some fresh air. I did not wait for his permission. I gently took Emily by the elbow and guided her out the heavy back door of the diner, stepping out into the cold, damp alleyway. The rain had temporarily stopped, leaving a heavy, suffocating humidity in the air. The alley smelled of wet garbage and rusted metal. I backed Emily under the dark awning of the brick building out of sight from the main street. She immediately pressed her back against the rough brick wall, wrapping her thin arms protectively over her pregnant belly. She was hyperventilating, her chest heaving as she desperately tried to catch her breath. I stood 2 feet away from her, my mind spinning 1,000,000 miles an hour. Everything I thought I knew was a lie. My son, the polished, highly successful private equity director. The boy I had raised with every ounce of love, sweat, and discipline I had in my body. He had looked me right in the eyes and told me his wife was a common thief. Yet here she was, hiding in the shadows, terrified that the man she married was going to murder her and their unborn baby. I looked at her shaking frame. I thought about the innocent child growing inside her. A sudden freezing cold realization washed over me. If Emily was telling the truth, if she was truly in life-threatening danger, then who had I been inviting into my home? Who had I been comforting and funding for the last 7 months? The sadness inside me suddenly vanished. It was entirely replaced by a quiet, dangerous, calculated fury that only a man who has worked his whole life to protect his family can truly feel. I took a deep, steadying breath, fighting to keep my voice completely calm. I looked Emily directly in her tear-filled eyes. I promised myself right then and there that I was not going to let anyone hurt her, not even my own flesh and blood. But first, I needed her to tell me exactly what kind of monster my son had become. I stood in the damp, foul-smelling alleyway as the heavy Midwestern humidity pressed down on us like a wet blanket. Emily was shivering uncontrollably despite the suffocating heat. Her thin, pale arms wrapped tightly around the heavy swell of her pregnant stomach. I looked closely at her worn, scuffed canvas shoes, the frayed edges of her faded uniform, and the sheer exhaustion etched into every line of her face. As I watched her struggle to breathe, my mind was forcibly dragged back to a freezing night, exactly 7 months ago. It was late November in the suburban Chicago area. It was the kind of bitter night where the wind coming off Lake Michigan cuts right through your winter coat and settles deep into your bones. I had been sitting peacefully in my quiet living room, drinking a warm cup of decaf coffee and reading the evening paper by the fire. Suddenly, the heavy oak front door of my house burst open. It was Jason, my highly successful, always composed, impeccably dressed son, the boy who was always in absolute control of every situation. But that night, he was a completely unrecognizable wreck. He collapsed onto the thick entryway rug. His expensive wool coat was soaked through with freezing sleet. He was sobbing so violently that he could barely draw a breath, his shoulders heaving with every painful gasp. I immediately rushed over my bad knees, screaming in protest, and pulled his heavy frame up from the cold floor. I held him tightly, just like I used to when he was a little boy who had badly scraped his knee playing on the concrete driveway. He buried his face in my shoulder, his tears soaking right through my warm flannel shirt, and he cried to me, "Dad, she is gone. She took everything and she is gone." I asked him what he meant, desperately trying to keep my own rising panic in check as I guided him to the living room couch. Jason looked up at me with swollen, bloodshot eyes and told me a story that completely shattered my heart into pieces. He told me he had just come home from a grueling week of out-of-state meetings to find their large, beautiful house completely empty. Emily had packed all her bags, cleared out her closets, and vanished without a trace. But that was not the worst part. Jason claimed with absolute conviction that Emily had secretly gained unauthorized access to his private equity firm's main operating bank accounts. He told me she had ruthlessly transferred every single dollar out of the business, effectively bankrupting him and his partners in a single afternoon. He said she had left a cruel typed note on the granite kitchen counter, brazenly confessing that she had been having a passionate affair for over a year. According to Jason, she was running away to Europe with her new lover, using his entire life savings and his investors' money to fund their sudden escape. I remember feeling a blinding protective rage toward Emily that night. I held my broken son as he wept, telling me his entire prestigious career was over. He said his furious investors were going to sue him, that he would inevitably face severe federal charges for the missing corporate funds, and that he was going to lose his beautiful home and his pristine reputation. He was staring directly down the barrel of complete financial and personal ruin. As a loving father, you do not even think twice when your child is in agonizing pain. My fierce protective paternal instincts completely took over every rational thought. I told him to look at me, to breathe deeply, and I firmly promised him I would fix this disaster. The very next morning, the second the bank doors unlocked, I sat down at the heavy mahogany desk of my financial advisor. I did not ask any probing questions. I did not demand to see police reports or business bank statements. I just acted out of pure and unconditional love. I authorized the immediate penalty-heavy liquidation of my most secure long-term retirement bonds. These were the very bonds I had painstakingly built over 40 grueling years of breathing in toxic drywall dust, carrying heavy lumber up steep stairs and working exhausting weekends. It was exactly $200,000 in clean, untraceable cash. I transferred every single penny of my hard-earned safety net directly into Jason's corporate account to instantly cover the supposedly stolen funds and keep his business afloat. I willingly wiped out a massive chunk of my life's security, entirely believing I was saving my only son from the utter devastation caused by a wicked, greedy, heartless woman. I never ever spoke of the very large sum of money again. But now, standing perfectly still in this miserable, garbage-filled alley, the accepted reality of that cold November night violently clashed with the undeniable reality standing right in front of me. I stared at Emily's trembling hands and her dirty waitress apron. If she had actually stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars and run off to the sunny coast of Europe with a wealthy lover, why was she here? Why was she working grueling shifts for minimum wage in a filthy roadside diner? A smart, cunning woman who successfully pulls off a massive, sophisticated corporate financial heist does not hide in the damp, depressing shadows of a dying Midwestern town, looking like she has not eaten a proper hot meal in days. My experienced brain slowly connected the jagged dots with horrifying, sickening clarity. Someone in this twisted scenario was lying to me, and it was a massive $200,000 lie. The money I had physically bled for the money I had instantly handed over to save my son from prison had not been used to rescue his company from a malicious thief. Jason had intentionally lied to me. I needed the truth, and I would get it. I looked deep into her exhausted eyes and asked her to tell me everything. I needed to know exactly why my son, the boy I raised to be an honorable man, would ever make his pregnant wife fear for her life. Emily took a shaky breath, her hands still wrapped protectively around her stomach. She looked down at the wet pavement and told me a story that sounded like it belonged in a cheap crime novel. She claimed that Jason was secretly a severe gambling addict. According to Emily, his trips out of state for supposed business meetings were actually long weekends spent in high-stakes underground poker rooms and offshore casinos. She said he had developed a sickness, an uncontrollable urge to bet massive amounts of money, chasing losses, until he had completely drained their personal savings and began dipping heavily into his company corporate accounts. She told me that a few weeks before she vanished, strange cars had started parking across the street from their house. Dark-tinted windows, men sitting inside for hours just watching the property. She said Jason became increasingly paranoid and violently erratic. He stopped sleeping. He started drinking heavily in the middle of the day. Whenever she tried to ask him about the missing money or the strange men outside, she claimed he would explode into terrifying fits of rage. He threw a heavy glass vase at her head, shattering it against the kitchen wall. He backed her into a corner and grabbed her by the throat, telling her that if she ever spoke to anyone about his financial problems, he would make sure she never spoke again. She said he owed extremely dangerous people millions of dollars, and they were threatening to hurt her to get their money back. So she packed whatever she could carry in a single duffel bag, left the fake note he forced her to write, and ran as far away as she could. I stood there listening to the rain slowly start to fall again, letting her words sink into my brain. On the surface, it was a perfectly plausible excuse. It perfectly explained the missing corporate funds, the sudden disappearance, and the paralyzing fear radiating from her every movement. It made sense that a young, terrified wife would believe this narrative and flee for her life. But as I watched her cry, my seasoned instincts began to scream that something was fundamentally wrong. My gut, forged over decades of dealing with all kinds of men in the construction business, told me this story simply did not add up. I know my son. I know the dark corners of his personality better than anyone else on this earth. Jason is many things, but he is absolutely not a gambler. He is a meticulous, obsessive control freak. Since he was a little boy organizing his toy cars by color and size, he has absolutely despised unpredictability. He hates risk. The very concept of leaving his hard-earned wealth up to the random flip of a card or the spin of a roulette wheel goes entirely against his psychological makeup. Jason needs to be the smartest person in the room. He needs to hold all the cards. A gambling addiction is messy, chaotic, and driven by raw emotion. Jason is cold, calculating, and exceptionally arrogant. I realized in that moment that Emily was either lying to me to cover up her own involvement, or more likely, she was completely ignorant of the actual truth. Jason had fed her a convenient lie to explain the missing money and the sudden danger. He had purposefully terrorized her, using the excuse of imaginary loan sharks to force her into hiding or to cover up a much darker, much more sinister reality. She was a pawn in a game she did not even understand. She believed she was running from violent thugs, but I knew she was running from a carefully constructed illusion. But I understood. I knew that whatever my son was actually doing, it was far more calculated and infinitely more dangerous than a simple gambling debt. I did not share my suspicions with her. She was already living in a state of pure terror, and breaking her fragile reality would only push her completely over the edge. Instead, I gave her the only thing I could in that moment: comfort and absolute silence. I reached into my leather wallet and pulled out every single dollar bill I had. It was a little over $300 in loose cash. I gently pressed the crumpled bills into her small, freezing hands and folded her fingers over the money. I looked her directly in the eyes, speaking with the calm, unwavering authority of a father making a solemn vow. I promised her on my life that I had never seen her. I told her that as far as I was concerned, she was a ghost, and Jason would never hear a single syllable about this diner or this town from my lips. I told her to buy herself a hot meal, to take care of my grandchild, and to stay hidden until she heard from me again. I did not wait for her to thank me. I turned around and walked slowly back to my truck, the rain soaking through my shirt. I climbed into the driver's seat, gripped the cold steering wheel, and stared out at the highway. I was driving back to Chicago, but I was not going home. I was going to carefully tear down every single wall my son had built to hide his sins. I would become his shadow. I would watch his every move, listen to his every lie, and find out exactly where my hard-earned money had really gone. I would protect my innocent, unborn grandchild at all costs, even if it meant destroying the very son I had spent my entire life trying to build up and protect. I drove away into darkness. I drove away into darkness. The relentless rain battered the windshield of my old Ford truck as I merged onto the desolate stretch of interstate leading back toward Chicago. The steady, rhythmic thumping of the wiper blades felt like a metronome counting down the seconds of my fractured reality. I stared blankly at the hypnotic red glow of the taillights miles ahead of me. My hands were gripping the worn leather steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles had turned completely white. For the first 50 miles, my mind was entirely consumed by a blinding, suffocating numbness. I was a father suspended in a terrifying void between what I had always believed to be true and the horrifying nightmare I had just witnessed in that filthy alleyway. I kept seeing Emily's terrified face illuminated by the flickering neon sign of the diner. I kept hearing the raw, broken pitch of her voice begging me to hide her existence from my own flesh and blood. Every time I blinked, The image of her swollen stomach flashed behind my eyelids. My unborn grandchild. A child forced to grow up in the shadows because of the man I had raised. How does a father reconcile the sweet, innocent boy he raised with the cold, calculating monster that boy has apparently become? That is the agonizing question that tore through my soul with every passing mile marker. I tried desperately to search my memories for any early warning signs. I thought back to Jason as a little boy playing in the backyard of our old neighborhood. I remembered teaching him how to ride a bicycle without training wheels. I remembered his bright, eager smile when he caught his very first fish on our summer camping trip to the lake. I had spent my entire adult life working myself to the bone just to ensure he would have every single opportunity I never had. I paid for the expensive private schools. I covered his massive college tuition so he could graduate without a single dime of debt. I bought him his first tailored suit when he landed his prestigious internship. I had literally poured every ounce of my love, my sweat, and my financial security into building him into a successful, respectable man. And what was my ultimate reward for all those decades of unconditional sacrifice? My son had transformed into an unrecognizable predator who terrorized his pregnant wife and manipulated his elderly father out of his life savings. The sheer magnitude of his betrayal felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest, making it difficult to draw a full breath. A weaker man might have pulled over to the side of the dark highway and wept until he had nothing left. Another man might have immediately picked up his cell phone, dialed the police, and demanded they arrest his son for domestic terrorism and financial fraud. But I did not cry, and I certainly did not reach for my phone. Calling the authorities right now would be a catastrophic mistake. I had absolutely no concrete proof. If I marched into a police precinct with nothing but a wild story about a terrified waitress in a roadside diner, Jason would easily spin the narrative to make me look like a confused, senile old man. He had the money, the high-priced corporate lawyers, and the polished, undeniable charm to talk his way out of anything. If he found out that I knew Emily was alive, he would not just silence me. He would use all his vast resources to hunt her down. I could not risk her life or the life of my grandchild on a hasty emotional reaction. If I wanted to protect them and uncover the absolute truth, I had to play a much more dangerous game. I had to become the very thing Jason believed me to be. A clueless, trusting, slightly dim-witted old father who suspected absolutely nothing. I decided right then and there in the dark cab of my truck that I was going to systematically dismantle my son's perfect life from the inside out. I was going to find out exactly where my $200,000 went. I was going to uncover every single dirty secret he was hiding behind his expensive tailored suits and his fake sympathetic tears. I would use my unrestricted access to his home and his life to quietly gather the undeniable evidence needed to destroy him legally and financially. It would require immense patience and a level of emotional detachment I had never experienced before. I had to bury my boiling rage deep down in my gut and replace it with a cold, calculated determination. I would smile at him. I would offer him comforting words. I would let him believe he had completely won. By the time the sprawling, glittering skyline of Chicago finally appeared on the distant horizon, the torrential rain had slowed to a light drizzle. The sky was beginning to lighten, with the first faint traces of dawn, but the darkness inside my heart was absolute. I navigated the familiar winding roads of the upscale Lincoln Park neighborhood, passing by the massive manicured lawns and the silent, towering mansions. I finally turned my heavy truck onto the pristine paved driveway of Jason's luxurious estate. This was the exact house I had helped him secure. The house funded by my blood and my endless sacrifices. I shifted the truck into park and turned off the engine, plunging the cab into a heavy, suffocating silence. I sat there for a long moment, staring at the massive, ornate front doors. I took one final deep breath, locking my grief and my anger away in a vault deep inside my mind. I practiced my warm, trusting smile in the rearview mirror. I opened the heavy metal door, stepped out into the cool morning air, and walked slowly toward the large house perfectly prepared to greet the absolute devil I had raised. I walked up the wide stone steps of the magnificent Lincoln Park estate. The morning air was crisp and cold, a stark contrast to the burning heat radiating inside my chest. I pressed the illuminated doorbell, listening to the soft, melodic chime echo through the massive house. It was a house I had practically bought for him, a house meant to be a safe haven for his family. As I waited on the heavy slate porch, I meticulously arranged my facial features into the weary, gentle expression of an aging father who had spent the night driving back from a tiring trip. The heavy oak door swung open, and there stood Jason. He was dressed in a pristine tailored linen shirt and expensive dark trousers, looking completely refreshed and vibrant. The tragic sobbing boy who had collapsed on my living room floor 7 months ago was entirely gone. In his place was a man who exuded absolute control and arrogant confidence. He gave me a wide, perfectly practiced smile that reached his mouth but completely failed to touch his eyes. "Dad," he said, his voice dripping with forced warmth. "You are back early. Come in, let me get you a cup of coffee." He reached out and pulled me into a tight embrace. I had to force my muscles not to instantly lock up. I wrapped my arms around his shoulders, breathing in his sharp, expensive cologne, and I felt a wave of absolute physical nausea wash over me. I was hugging a stranger. I was hugging a man who had intentionally terrorized his pregnant wife into hiding in a filthy roadside diner. But I patted his back gently, playing my part flawlessly. I told him the drive was long and my old bones were aching. We walked into the sprawling kitchen, a masterpiece of white marble and gleaming stainless steel. Everything in the room was spotless, sterilized, completely devoid of any trace that Emily had ever lived there. Jason busied himself at the high-end espresso machine, chatting casually about the weather and his upcoming golf weekend. I sat down on one of the expensive leather bar stools, watching his hands move with steady, practiced precision. I decided it was time to cast the first line into the water. I let out a heavy, tired sigh and rubbed my temples. "Jason," I asked, keeping my voice low and laced with paternal concern, "how are things at the firm? I have been worried about you. Did the money I transferred help stabilize the accounts after the terrible mess Emily left behind?" Jason did not even flinch. He did not drop a spoon or hesitate in his pouring. He turned around, handed me a steaming ceramic mug, and leaned casually against the marble counter. He looked me dead in the eye with a terrifyingly calm expression. "Dad, you do not need to worry about a single thing," he said smoothly. "The firm is actually having its best quarter in the history of the company. We completely plugged the holes. We recovered the lost capital, and our new investor portfolios are absolutely booming. In fact, we have already completely recuperated the $200,000 you so generously lent me. I am going to have my accountant draw up the paperwork to transfer your money back to you with interest by the end of the year." It was a flawless performance. The pitch of his voice was perfectly reassuring. His posture was relaxed. If I had not just spent the previous afternoon looking into the hollow, terrified eyes of his pregnant wife, I would have believed every single word falling from his mouth. But I knew the truth. I knew that Emily had not stolen a dime. I knew she was currently working for minimum wage in a damp, grease-stained uniform. If Jason had supposedly recuperated hundreds of thousands of dollars, why did Emily believe he owed massive debts to dangerous men? The discrepancy was glaring, massive, and undeniable. My son was not just lying to me to save face. He was constructing an elaborate, highly calculated financial illusion. He had no intention of ever paying me back a single dollar. He was just placating a foolish old man. I took a slow sip of the bitter black coffee, letting the burning liquid coat my throat. I offered him a grateful, relieved smile. I told him I was incredibly proud of his resilience, praising his strength for overcoming such a devastating betrayal. Every word of praise tasted like ash in my mouth, but I delivered it with absolute conviction. Jason beamed, absorbing the false compliments with greedy, sickening arrogance. He truly believed he was the smartest person in the room. He believed he had completely outsmarted his own father. Just as Jason was finishing his self-congratulatory speech about his brilliant market strategies, a sound interrupted us from the main hallway. The sharp, rhythmic clicking of high heels against the polished hardwood floor echoed through the quiet house. I turned my head slowly, gripping my coffee mug. Walking into the bright, sunlit kitchen was a woman I had never seen before. She was tall, stunningly beautiful, and dressed in a sleek designer silk robe that looked like it cost more than my first truck. Her dark hair was perfectly styled, falling in soft waves over her shoulders. She had high, sharp cheekbones and a flawlessly manicured appearance that commanded immediate attention. But it was not her beauty that caught my eye. It was the massive, blinding diamond ring glittering violently on her left hand. It was a stone so large and pristine it caught the morning sunlight and threw harsh reflections across the white marble walls. Jason immediately pushed off the counter and walked over to her, wrapping his arm possessively around her waist. He kissed her cheek with a sickeningly sweet smile and turned to face me. "Dad," he said, his voice practically singing with manufactured joy, "I have been waiting for the perfect moment to introduce you. This is Victoria. She is the woman who pulled me out of the darkness. We are engaged." I sat frozen on the leather stool, staring at the woman standing before me. Victoria offered a bright, dazzling smile that showed off a row of perfectly white, symmetrical teeth. She glided across the kitchen, her expensive silk robe flowing behind her, and wrapped her arms around my neck in a tight, overly familiar hug. "Oh, William," she practically purred into my ear, her floral perfume so heavy and intoxicating it made my head spin. "Jason has told me absolutely everything about you. You are practically a legend in this house. It is so wonderful to finally meet the man who raised such an incredible partner." I gently pulled back from her embrace, offering a polite nod. I looked directly into her eyes. They were a striking shade of pale blue, but they were completely devoid of any genuine warmth. They were the cold, calculating eyes of a predator assessing the value of its prey. She looked at me not as a future father-in-law, but as a minor, easily manageable obstacle in her path. My mind instantly began doing the brutal, terrifying math. Emily had only been gone for 7 months. When Jason had come to my house crying on that freezing November night, he claimed his entire world was completely destroyed. He claimed he was a broken man, incapable of trusting anyone ever again. Yet here was Victoria standing in his kitchen, completely moved and acting as the undisputed lady of the manor. A custom diamond ring of that magnitude takes weeks, sometimes months, to design and procure. A relationship solid enough to warrant an engagement and a shared address does not blossom out of thin air in a matter of weeks following a supposedly devastating marital betrayal. The timeline was not just incredibly convenient, it was completely impossible. Victoria had not miraculously appeared after Emily vanished to heal his broken heart. Victoria had been here all along. She was an integral part of the plan. I realized with a sickening jolt that Emily had been purposefully and ruthlessly replaced. Jason had never been mourning his wife. He had been actively clearing the stage for her wealthy, glamorous successor. Victoria walked over to the expensive espresso machine, casually mentioning how they were planning to completely gut and remodel the upstairs bedrooms. She talked about tearing out the old carpets and bringing in a private interior designer to completely erase the lingering, dreary energy of the house. She was actively and aggressively erasing every single trace that Emily and my unborn grandchild had ever existed in this physical space. I sat there sipping my cooling coffee, nodding along to her endless chatter. I played the role of the delighted, supportive father perfectly. I congratulated them both on finding love after such a dark period. But beneath the surface, my blood was running completely cold. I was sitting in a room with 2 highly dangerous, entirely remorseless individuals. They were building a luxurious new life, directly on top of the terrified, shattered existence of a young pregnant woman hiding out in the rain. I knew I had to be more careful than I had ever been in my entire life. I was no longer just dealing with a greedy, deceitful son. I was dealing with a united front of absolute deception. I smiled warmly at Victoria, complimenting her beautiful ring, while silently vowing to tear their entire glittering empire straight to the ground. That evening, Jason absolutely insisted that I stay for a formal dinner to properly celebrate their sudden and miraculous engagement. I agreed with a warm nod, playing the part of the overjoyed father who was thrilled to see his son moving on from such a supposedly devastating heartbreak. The dinner was served in the massive formal dining room of the Lincoln Park estate. The long mahogany table was meticulously set with fine crystal wine glasses, heavy polished silver cutlery, and expensive porcelain plates. A private chef hired specifically for the occasion served us perfectly seared cuts of prime beef and delicate roasted vegetables. As I sat there cutting into my expensive meal, my mind involuntarily flashed back to the dark, damp alleyway. I kept picturing Emily shivering in her thin, grease-stained uniform, probably eating a leftover piece of cold toast, while the father of her unborn child dined like royalty. The stark, sickening contrast between her horrifying reality and his luxurious deception made the rich food taste like dry sawdust in my mouth. I chewed slowly, forcing myself to swallow, maintaining a pleasant, relaxed expression, while my son and his new fiancée laughed and drank heavily from a bottle of incredibly expensive imported red wine. Victoria was playing the role of the perfect, gracious hostess. She constantly refilled my water glass, touched my arm gently whenever she spoke to me, and asked superficial, polite questions about my quiet life in the suburbs. Jason sat at the head of the table looking incredibly smug and completely satisfied with his perfectly constructed world. The conversation flowed smoothly through safe, mundane topics like golf tournaments, stock market trends, and their upcoming vacation plans to the Caribbean. I sat back nursing a glass of sparkling water, carefully observing their interactions. They moved perfectly in sync, sharing knowing glances and finishing each other's sentences. It was the seamless, practiced choreography of two people who had been intimately involved for a very long time, not a couple who had magically found each other in the wake of a recent tragedy. As the plates were cleared away and the private chef quietly exited through the swinging kitchen doors, the atmosphere in the dining room noticeably shifted. Victoria leaned forward, resting her elbows delicately on the polished mahogany table. She swirled the dark red wine in her crystal glass, the massive diamond on her finger, catching the warm light of the crystal chandelier above us. She offered me a sweet, dazzling smile that did not quite reach her pale blue eyes. "So, Bill," she asked, her voice casually floating across the table like a poisonous mist, "when exactly are we putting that old farmhouse of yours on the market?" The air in my lungs completely froze. I stopped breathing. The heavy silence in the dining room stretched out for what felt like an absolute eternity. I stared at her perfectly painted red lips, my brain forcefully processing the sheer audacity of her question. She was talking about my farmhouse, the sprawling, beautiful piece of rural property located just outside the city limits. That farmhouse was not just a piece of real estate. It was the very last major asset I owned to my name. It was a sprawling 40-acre property that I had inherited directly from my late wife, Martha. Martha had grown up on that land. She loved those rolling green hills and the ancient oak trees more than anything in the world. When she was losing her brutal battle with cancer over a decade ago, I sat by her hospital bed, held her fragile hand, and made a sacred vow. I promised her I would never sell her family home to commercial developers. Over the past 10 years, the city suburbs had rapidly expanded, and that quiet piece of rural land was now sitting right in the middle of a highly coveted commercial zoning district. Real estate developers had been calling my phone for years, offering astronomical sums of money. The property was currently valued at well over $3 million. but I had never once entertained a single offer. I had never spoken a single word about selling the farmhouse to anyone, especially not to Jason. I knew he viewed the property as a massive pile of uncashed checks, but he had always known the land was completely off limits. Yet here was Victoria, a woman I had supposedly just met 3 hours ago, casually asking when we were putting it on the market. The use of the word echoed loudly inside my skull. When are we putting it on the market? I looked slowly from Victoria to Jason. Jason took a slow, deliberate sip of his wine, avoiding my direct gaze. He was watching me carefully, from the corner of his eye, waiting to see my reaction. The terrifying realization hit me with the crushing force of a freight train. They were not just arrogant and deceitful. They were systematic, cold-blooded financial predators. They had not just stolen my $200,000 to cover some imaginary business debt. That was simply the appetizer. They were actively circling my remaining assets like starving vultures. They saw me not as a grieving father, but as a foolish aging obstacle standing between them and a $3 million payday. They had somehow managed to completely eliminate Emily from the picture, and now they were actively plotting to strip me of everything I had left in the world. The sheer ruthless greed of it all made my hands tremble under the table. I gripped my napkin tightly, burying my fingernails into my palms to ground myself. I forced my facial muscles to relax into a gentle, confused smile. I let out a soft, chuckling sigh, playing the part of the sentimental old fool to absolute perfection. "Well, Victoria," I said, my voice completely steady and mild. "I honestly have not given it much thought. That old place holds a lot of deep memories of Martha for me. I suppose it is getting a bit too large and difficult for me to manage on my own these days with my bad knees, but I am not in any immediate rush to pack up my life." Victoria smiled brightly, her eyes flashing with a hungry, predatory gleam. "Of course, Bill," she said soothingly. "We completely understand. We just want to make sure you are comfortable and not burdened by unnecessary property maintenance. Jason has some wonderful connections with luxury developers who could handle the entire transaction very quietly and profitably whenever you are ready. We just want what is best for you." I nodded graciously, thanking her for her supposed concern, while every single instinct in my body screamed that I was sitting in a room with two monsters. I knew right then that my time was running out. They were already laying the groundwork to take the farmhouse, and I needed hard, undeniable proof of their crimes before they made their final move against me. As the tense dinner finally wound down, Jason wiped his mouth with his linen napkin and announced that the evening called for something truly special. He told Victoria he wanted to open a very rare vintage bottle of Cabernet he had been saving in his temperature-controlled wine cellar in the basement. He stood up, extending his hand to her. "Come down with me, darling," he said smoothly. "I want you to pick it out." Victoria eagerly took his hand, her diamond flashing under the lights. They both turned to me, offering polite smiles. "We will be right back, Dad," Jason said. "Make yourself comfortable in the living room." I nodded tiredly, placing my hand on my knee and wincing slightly. "Actually," I said, my voice slightly strained, "my arthritis is really acting up tonight. I think I will just use the upstairs guest restroom and then perhaps get ready to head home. It has been a very long day." Jason nodded sympathetically, completely buying my performance. "Take your time, Dad," he called over his shoulder as he and Victoria began descending the heavy wooden stairs leading down to the basement cellar. I sat perfectly still at the dining table, listening intently to the rhythmic sound of their footsteps fading into the distance. I heard the heavy reinforced door of the wine cellar click firmly shut. The house plunged into a deep, heavy silence. My heart immediately began pounding violently against my ribs. The dull ache in my knees completely vanished, replaced by a massive surge of pure adrenaline. I pushed myself up from the table and moved with a quiet, desperate speed I had not possessed in 20 years. I did not go to the upstairs bathroom. Instead, I moved swiftly down the carpeted hallway toward the back of the house, heading directly for Jason's private home office. The heavy mahogany door to his office was firmly closed, but to my absolute relief, it was not locked. I turned the brass handle silently and slipped inside, pushing the door softly shut behind me. The room was dark, illuminated only by the pale moonlight spilling through the large security windows. I did not dare turn on the overhead lights. I pulled a small pen light from my jacket pocket, the one I always carried for inspecting dark crawl spaces on construction sites, and clicked it on. The narrow beam of white light swept across the immaculate room. There were custom-built bookshelves, a leather reading chair, and a massive glass-topped executive desk sitting directly in the center of the room. I moved quickly behind the desk, my eyes darting across the perfectly organized surface. There were no loose papers, no open files. Jason was entirely too smart and too meticulous to leave incriminating financial evidence lying out in the open. I dropped to my hands and knees, ignoring the sharp pain shooting up my legs, and crawled under the heavy desk. Tucked away in the far back corner was a sleek black metal trash bin. I pulled it out and shined my light inside. It was mostly empty, but sitting at the very bottom was a pile of freshly shredded documents. The paper strips were thin, but whoever had used the machine had rushed the job, feeding several pages through at an awkward angle. A few chunks of paper had survived the blades relatively intact. I carefully reached in and pulled out a jagged, torn piece. I held it up to the narrow beam of my penlight. There was a partial corporate logo printed at the top, and beneath it, a string of bold black numbers next to the word Cayman. It was an international banking code, a routing number for an offshore account. My son was moving massive amounts of money outside the jurisdiction of the United States government. I shoved the torn piece of paper deep into my trousers pocket. I stood up quickly and began quietly opening the heavy desk drawers. The first two contained nothing but expensive pens and blank stationery. But when I pulled open the large bottom drawer, my breath caught in my throat. Tucked carefully underneath a stack of yellow legal pads was a thick, heavy manila folder. I gently pulled it out and laid it on the glass desk. The bold, printed logo on the front cover belonged to one of the largest high-risk life insurance conglomerates in the country. My hands actually began to shake as I stared at it. Why would my son, a healthy 35-year-old man with supposedly no dependents, possess a massive high-risk life insurance policy hidden at the bottom of his desk? I reached out to flip open the heavy cardboard cover. I needed to see the name on the policy. I needed to see the exact dollar amount. Just as my fingers touched the edge of the folder, a sharp, terrifying sound echoed through the quiet house. It was the loud metallic click of the basement wine cellar door unlatching. I froze completely. Heavy footsteps began ascending the wooden stairs. I could hear Victoria's high-pitched laughter ringing clearly through the hallway. They had found their wine much faster than I had anticipated, and they were heading straight back toward the living room. If Jason walked past the hallway and noticed the office door was completely closed instead of slightly ajar the way he had left it, he would know instantly that someone was inside. Panic, cold and sharp, seized my chest. I hastily shoved the thick insurance folder back into the bottom drawer, burying it frantically under the yellow legal pads. I pushed the drawer shut, wincing at the soft thud of the wood sliding into place. I clicked off my penlight, plunging the office back into complete darkness. I crept toward the door, my heart hammering so loudly in my ears, I was certain they could hear it through the walls. I pressed my ear against the cold mahogany wood. The footsteps were getting louder, moving directly down the main corridor. Jason was talking loudly about the vintage year of the wine. I waited for an agonizing split second until his voice was directed away from the hallway. I turned the brass handle, slipped silently out of the office, and pushed the door perfectly into its original position. I practically sprinted down the short adjoining hallway and threw myself into the guest bathroom, immediately twisting the metal handles of the sink. The water roared to life just as a dark shadow crossed the space beneath the bathroom door. I leaned heavily over the porcelain sink, splashing freezing cold water onto my sweating face. I stared at my pale, terrified reflection in the vanity mirror, breathing heavily. I reached into my pocket, my fingers brushing against the torn piece of paper. I had survived my first search, and I had my very first piece of undeniable physical evidence. My son was hiding millions, and I was going to find every single penny. I drove home that night with the torn piece of paper burning a hole in my pocket. The sheer magnitude of what I had discovered in my son's dark office was entirely too large for me to handle alone. I was a retired construction worker, a man who built houses with wood and nails. I was completely out of my depth when it came to offshore bank accounts, corporate fraud, and multi-million-dollar life insurance policies. I knew that if I made even one single mistake, Jason would immediately destroy the evidence and potentially accelerate whatever terrifying plan he had in motion. I needed a professional. I needed someone who understood the dark, twisted labyrinth of financial crimes. The very next morning, I drove to a rundown commercial district on the south side of the city. I parked my truck in front of a small, dingy office building, sandwiched between a pawn shop and a liquor store. I was there to meet a man named Bradley Mitchell. Bradley was a cynical, chain-smoking retired fraud investigator who had spent 30 years working for the largest insurance companies in the world. He was the kind of man who hunted down people who faked their own deaths or burned down their businesses for a payout. He had a reputation for being ruthless, incredibly sharp, and entirely off the grid. I walked into his cramped office. It smelled heavily of stale coffee and old paper. Bradley was sitting behind a battered metal desk, reviewing a thick stack of files. He looked up at me with tired gray eyes. I did not waste any time with pleasantries. I sat down in the creaky wooden chair opposite his desk and laid the torn piece of shredded paper directly in front of him. I told him absolutely everything. I told him about Emily hiding in the diner, the missing $200,000, the sudden appearance of Victoria, and the hidden life insurance folder. Bradley listened to my entire story without interrupting once. When I finished, he picked up the torn piece of paper, put on a pair of thick reading glasses, and studied the printed routing number. He let out a low whistle. He told me that this specific bank in the Cayman Islands was notorious for laundering dirty money and setting up untraceable shell companies. He looked me dead in the eye and said my son was playing a very deadly game. He agreed to take this case, but he gave me one strict, terrifying condition. He told me I had to become completely invisible. I had to make Jason believe I was absolutely harmless. I understood exactly what he meant. For the next 3 weeks, I put on the greatest acting performance of my entire life. I had to bury my burning rage and transform myself into a pathetic, declining old man. Whenever I visited Jason and Victoria at their sprawling mansion, I intentionally dragged my feet when I walked. I let my shoulders slump. I purposely wore my shirts slightly unbuttoned and forgot to comb my hair. But the most crucial part of my disguise was feigning a rapid mental decline. I started misplacing my belongings on purpose. I would leave my reading glasses in the refrigerator and pretend to spend 20 minutes frantically searching for them. I would ask Jason the exact same question 3 times in a single afternoon, acting completely confused when he grew frustrated. I watched their reactions very closely. At first, Jason seemed mildly annoyed by my constant forgetfulness. But as the days passed, his annoyance slowly morphed into a sickening, triumphant smugness. He and Victoria would exchange knowing, victorious glances whenever I lost my train of thought mid-sentence. They genuinely believed my mind was deteriorating exactly as they had hoped. One evening, while we were sitting in their living room, I intentionally spilled a glass of water on the expensive rug and apologized profusely, my hands shaking on purpose. Victoria smiled that cold, predatory smile of hers and patted my arm, telling me not to worry about my little accidents. Behind my confused, watery eyes, my mind was sharper than it had ever been. I was watching them lower their guards. Because they believed I was losing my mind, they became incredibly careless. They started leaving financial documents out on the kitchen counter. They spoke openly about their luxury purchases and offshore transfers in the next room, completely convinced I was too deaf and too stupid to understand what they were discussing. They thought I was a dying old dog, but they had absolutely no idea they were letting a wolf straight into their house. My disguise was working flawlessly, but I needed more than just overheard conversations. I needed concrete, undeniable audio evidence of their crimes. I needed to hear Jason confess to exactly what he was planning. Bradley had provided me with a tiny, incredibly sophisticated voice-activated recording device. It was no larger than a standard postage stamp designed to pick up whispers from across a large room. The battery could last for weeks on standby. But getting it into Jason's home office was too risky now that Victoria was almost always in the house. I realized the best place to catch him discussing his illicit financial schemes was exactly where he conducted his business. I had to infiltrate his downtown private equity firm. I decided to use my new pathetic persona to my absolute advantage. Early on a Tuesday afternoon, I stopped by a high-end deli and bought 2 expensive roast beef sandwiches and a large container of hot, black coffee. I placed them in a paper bag and drove to the towering glass skyscraper that housed his firm. When I stepped off the elevator onto the top floor, the sheer opulence of the office hit me. Everything was sleek chrome-polished glass and imported marble. The receptionist, a young woman with a perfectly practiced smile, looked at my flannel shirt and worn boots with thinly veiled disdain. I gave her my best confused elderly smile and told her I was Jason's father, bringing my hard-working boy some lunch. She reluctantly buzzed me through the heavy glass security doors. I slowly shuffled down the quiet carpeted hallway until I reached Jason's massive corner office. The door was slightly open. He was sitting behind a large modern desk, aggressively typing on his laptop, completely absorbed in his screen. I pushed the door open and called out his name with a wavering, cheerful voice. Jason looked up, and for a split second, a flash of pure irritation crossed his face before he managed to quickly replace it with a tight, forced smile. "Dad," he said, his tone dripping with impatience. "What are you doing here? I am right in the middle of a very critical market analysis." I clutched the paper bag to my chest and apologized weakly, telling him I just wanted to see his beautiful office and share a meal with him. I shuffled over to his desk, my hands intentionally trembling as I began unpacking the sandwiches. I placed the large cardboard cup of scalding hot coffee near the edge of his desk. He sighed heavily, rubbing his temples, completely irritated by my presence. This was my absolute only chance. As I reached across the desk to hand him a napkin, I intentionally let my wrist hit the side of the large coffee cup. The lid popped off and the scalding dark liquid flooded across the pristine polished wood of his desk, narrowly missing his expensive laptop and soaking into a stack of printed reports. Jason leaped up from his leather chair, cursing loudly. "Dad, what is wrong with you?" he yelled completely, dropping his loving son facade. "Look at what you just did!" He frantically grabbed a handful of thin tissues from a nearby box, but it was useless against the spreading puddle. He stormed toward his office door, shouting down the hallway for his assistant to immediately bring some thick towels and a janitor. The second his back was completely turned, I dropped the pathetic old man routine. I moved with lightning speed. I pulled the tiny adhesive-backed recorder from my jacket pocket, ducked smoothly under the edge of his desk, and firmly pressed the device high up into the dark hidden corner behind the wooden modesty panel. It took exactly 3 seconds. By the time Jason spun back around, aggressively rubbing his temples in sheer frustration, I was already standing back up, my hands visibly shaking, babbling endless, pathetic apologies. "I am so sorry, Jason," I stammered, making my voice crack with manufactured shame. "My hands are just so clumsy lately. I did not mean to ruin your important papers." Jason stared at me with a look of absolute disgust. The mask of the loving son had completely slipped, revealing the cold, arrogant monster underneath. "Just go home, Dad," he snapped, waving his hand dismissively as his assistant rushed into the room with a stack of towels. "Just go home and rest. You are causing a massive scene." I nodded meekly, keeping my head bowed in fabricated humiliation. I shuffled slowly out of his office, walking carefully down the long glass hallway to the elevators. I pressed the down button and waited, my shoulders slumped in apparent defeat. But as the heavy metal doors slid shut, separating me from the pristine reception area, I finally stood up straight. A cold, triumphant smile slowly spread across my face. My blood was absolutely boiling with pure anticipation. The bug was planted right in the heart of his empire. Every single lie, every dirty transaction, every threat he made in that office would now be captured. The long game had officially begun, and my son had no idea his downfall was already ticking away under his own desk. 3 days passed in an agonizing blur of silence. I spent those 72 hours sitting in my empty house staring at the walls, jumping every time my cell phone buzzed. I had left the recording device under Jason's desk on a Tuesday. By Friday evening, the waiting had become almost physically unbearable. Finally, just as the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the Chicago sky in bruised shades of purple and gray, my phone rang. It was Bradley. He did not bother with a greeting. He simply told me to meet him at the old municipal park on the south side of town in exactly 1 hour, and then he hung up. The abruptness of his call sent a sharp jolt of ice straight down my spine. I grabbed my thick wool coat, locked my front door, and drove through the darkening city streets with a heavy sense of dread settling in my stomach. The municipal park was completely deserted by the time I arrived. The tall, ancient oak trees cast long, terrifying shadows across the cracked concrete pathways. The only source of light was a few flickering street lamps scattered along the perimeter. I parked my truck under the dim yellow glow of a broken light pole and walked slowly toward a row of wooden benches facing the empty playground. Bradley was already there. He was sitting in the darkest corner smoking a cheap cigarette, the glowing red tip illuminating his deeply lined face. He had a thick brown manila envelope resting on his lap. I sat down next to him on the cold wooden slats. We did not speak for a long time. The only sound was the distant hum of highway traffic and the wind rustling through the dead leaves. Finally, Bradley dropped his cigarette onto the concrete, crushed it out beneath the heel of his heavy boot, and turned to look at me. His gray eyes were deadly serious. "William," he said, his voice a low, gravelly whisper, "I need you to brace yourself. I have spent the last 3 days digging through the offshore routing numbers you gave me, and I have been listening to the audio files from the device you planted in his office. You were absolutely right about your son. He is completely ruthless. But you were wrong about the scale of his operation. This is not just a little corporate embezzlement. This is a massive, highly coordinated financial bloodbath." I stared at him, my heart hammering against my ribs. I asked him if he had found out who Jason owed the gambling debts to. I asked if we needed to hire private security to protect Emily from violent loan sharks. Bradley shook his head slowly, a bitter, cynical smile touching the corners of his mouth. "There are no loan sharks, William," he replied quietly. "There are no underground poker rooms, and there are absolutely no secret offshore casinos. Your son is not a gambling addict. He has never placed a bet in his entire life. The gambling story was nothing but a carefully constructed lie. It was a terrifying fairy tale he invented specifically to feed his pregnant wife. He needed Emily to believe he was in danger from random street thugs, so she would not ask questions about the missing money, and more importantly, so she would be terrified enough to disappear when the time came." I felt the breath leave my lungs. "If there were no gambling debts," I asked, my voice trembling slightly, then, "where did all the money go? Where did my $200,000 go?" Bradley opened the heavy manila envelope and pulled out a stack of dense financial spreadsheets covered in red ink and highlighted numbers. He laid them out on the wooden bench between us. He explained that Jason's prestigious private equity firm was nothing but a beautiful hollow shell. There were no brilliant market strategies. There were no booming investor portfolios. For the past 4 years, Jason had been running a massive, highly sophisticated Ponzi scheme. He had been actively recruiting wealthy, unsuspecting investors, promising them incredibly high, guaranteed returns on their capital. But he was never actually investing their money in the market. Instead, he was using the fresh cash from new investors to pay the fictional dividends to the older investors, creating the absolute illusion of a highly profitable enterprise. All the while, he and Victoria were aggressively skimming millions of dollars off the top to fund their lavish lifestyle. The mansion, the designer clothes, and the massive diamond ring. I sat there in the freezing darkness, staring at the pages of undeniable proof. My son, the boy I had raised to value hard work and absolute honesty, was a professional predator. He had built his entire glamorous life on the shattered bank accounts of innocent people. But Bradley was not finished. He leaned closer, his voice dropping even lower, taking on a tone of absolute warning. A scheme like this requires a constant, massive influx of new victims to survive. Bradley explained, tapping a rigid finger against a column of red numbers. The moment the new money stops coming in, the entire pyramid collapses. And that is exactly what happened 6 months ago. The market shifted. The new investors completely dried up. But the old investors, the ones who had given Jason their life savings, started demanding their quarterly payouts. When Jason could not produce the cash, the beautiful illusion completely shattered. Bradley looked me dead in the eye, the gravity of the situation hanging heavy in the freezing air. Your son is currently $4 million in the hole, William. He is completely drowning. And the people he stole that money from are not just wealthy doctors or retired dentists. Some of his biggest clients are highly connected, extremely dangerous individuals who use private equity firms to clean their dirty money. These are people who do not file civil lawsuits when they get robbed. They send men in the middle of the night to break your legs or burn your house to the ground. Jason is backed into a terrifying corner. He is facing federal prison on one side and violent retaliation on the other. The sheer terror of the reality finally settled over me like a suffocating blanket. The strange cars Emily had seen parked across the street from their house all those months ago were not imaginary. They were furious, defrauded investors watching the man who had stolen their millions. Jason had intentionally terrorized his own wife using the real threat of these dangerous men to cover his own colossal financial crimes. He had happily taken my $200,000, knowing perfectly well that it would not even make a dent in his massive $4 million deficit. My hard-earned retirement fund had simply been tossed into a blazing inferno of debt, likely used to buy him just a few more weeks of breathing room. My son was not just a greedy thief. He was a desperate, cornered animal. And a cornered animal is capable of absolutely anything. If Jason was truly $4 million in debt, and his entire world was on the brink of violent collapse, why was he acting so incredibly calm? Why was he buying Victoria a massive diamond ring? Why were they remodeling the house? Desperate men do not buy expensive luxury jewelry. Desperate men pack their bags and run, unless they know a massive payday is coming. The horrific revelation hit me with a sickening physical force. He was sacrificing his family to save himself. I looked at Bradley, my jaw clenched so tight my teeth ached. I told him we needed to move faster. I was going to tear his entire empire straight down. I told him we needed to move faster. I was going to tear his entire empire straight down. Bradley did not smile, nor did he offer any comforting words of reassurance. He simply nodded his head slowly, his expression remaining completely grim under the pale yellow light of the broken street lamp. He reached his rough, calloused hand back into the thick manila envelope resting on his lap and pulled out a single, heavily redacted sheet of paper. He held it out to me. The freezing night wind whipped through the dead branches above us, sending a dry, rattling sound echoing across the empty park. I took the paper from his hand, my fingers completely numb from the biting cold. I squinted in the dim light, trying to make sense of the dense rows of banking transaction codes and international wire transfer logs printed across the page. William Bradley said, his voice cutting through the chilling wind. When you first came to my office, you told me that you gave your son exactly $200,000 in clean, untraceable cash. You liquidated your hard-earned retirement bonds because you believed you were rescuing his private equity firm from absolute ruin. You believed that money was going directly into his corporate operating accounts to replace the funds he claimed his wife had ruthlessly stolen. I nodded my head, my eyes scanning the complex financial document. I told Bradley that was the absolute truth. I had authorized the transfer the very next morning, desperately wanting to protect my son from facing federal prison and angry investors. Bradley tapped a rigid finger against a specific line of text near the bottom of the page. "That is the exact transaction record of your $200,000, he explained quietly. "I tracked the movement of your money from the moment it left your bank account. It did indeed go into Jason's primary corporate account, just as you intended. But it did not stay there. It did not go toward paying off his furious, defrauded investors. It was not used to plug any of the massive $4 million holes in his collapsing Ponzi scheme. Your son did not use your life savings to save his business." I stared at the numbers, a deep, sickening pit forming in my stomach. If he did not use it to pay his angry clients? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Then what did he do with it? Did he just pocket the money for himself? Did he use my blood and sweat to buy Victoria that massive diamond ring? Bradley shook his head, his gray eyes fixed intensely on mine. "Look closely at the timestamp on the right side of the page," he instructed. I moved the paper closer to the dim light, my eyes focusing on the exact date and time printed next to the outgoing wire transfer. The numbers burned themselves directly into my brain. The transfer had been initiated at exactly 11:45 at night on November 12th. It was the exact same night Jason had burst through my front door. It was the exact same night he had collapsed on my living room floor, sobbing hysterically into my shoulder, claiming that his wife had packed her bags and vanished. While I was holding him, comforting him, and promising to give him my entire life savings, he had already scheduled the international wire transfer. He had looked me directly in the eyes, playing the role of the broken, abandoned husband, knowing perfectly well that the machinery of his dark plan was already in motion. The sheer level of psychopathy required to pull off that kind of emotional manipulation against your own father was something I could not even begin to comprehend. My mind violently rejected the thought, but the cold, hard numbers printed on the page offered absolutely no room for doubt or denial. "He moved the money literally hours after Emily ran out of that house," Bradley stated, his voice devoid of any emotion. "He transferred the entire sum of $200,000 out of the country in one single massive transaction. And he sent it directly to the exact offshore routing number you found torn to pieces in the trash can of his home office. He sent it straight to the Cayman Islands." I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead, despite the freezing temperature. I tried to process the sheer calculated cruelty of his actions. I assumed he was just hiding the cash. I assumed he knew his entire fraudulent empire was on the verge of total collapse, and he was desperately stashing away a secret nest egg in an untraceable offshore account, so he and Victoria could eventually flee the country and live comfortably in the Caribbean. I looked up at Bradley, gripping the piece of paper so tightly the edges crumpled in my hands. "So it is a secret slush fund," I said, my voice thick with absolute disgust. "He is hiding my money in a private island bank to protect himself when the authorities finally come knocking on his door." Bradley leaned back against the cold wooden bench. The silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating. When he finally spoke, his words were so dark and so terrifying that my heart completely stopped beating in my chest. "No, William," Bradley said softly. "That is what I originally thought, too. When you brought me that routing number, I assumed it belonged to a standard offshore wealth management shell company. The kind of shadow bank rich criminals use to hide their yachts and avoid paying taxes. But I still have a few old contacts working deep inside the federal government. I made some highly classified phone calls. I had a friend in the bureau run that specific Cayman Islands routing number through their restricted international database." Bradley paused, taking a slow, shaky breath. The account your son wired your $200,000 to does not belong to a bank. It does not belong to a hedge fund, and it certainly does not belong to a mistress. It belongs to a very specific, highly dangerous ghost corporation. It is a known front company that has been under active investigation by the Federal Bureau of Investigation for the past 3 years. The world around me seemed to tilt dangerously on its axis. The howling wind in the trees faded into a dull, distant roar. What kind of company? I demanded, my voice cracking under the sheer weight of my mounting terror. Bradley looked at me with a profound, heavy sadness in his eyes. It is an international contracting firm, William. But they do not build houses and they do not manage stock portfolios. The Bureau has been tracking them because they specialize in providing a very specific, highly illegal service for wealthy, desperate clients who need permanent solutions to their problems. The company is a sophisticated broker for organized violent crimes. They are hired to make people completely disappear. They provide professional hitmen. The piece of paper slipped from my numb fingers and fluttered onto the cold concrete. The truth slammed into me with the devastating force of a physical blow. My son had not hidden my money. He had not used it to pay his angry investors. Jason had taken my $200,000, the money I had physically destroyed my body to earn, and he had used it to hire a professional assassin to murder his pregnant wife. Emily had not been running from imaginary loan sharks. She had been running from a highly trained killer paid for with my own retirement fund. I was the one who had unknowingly funded the hit on my own family. The darkness of the park suddenly felt like it was closing in on me, suffocating me, as the true monstrous nature of my own flesh and blood was finally laid bare. I left the freezing municipal park that night with a singular, terrifying objective. I needed to retrieve the hidden audio recorder from my son's downtown office. The physical evidence Bradley had uncovered was damning, but a wire transfer to a shadow company was still just a paper trail. I needed to hear Jason admit to the unimaginable. The very next morning, I returned to the towering glass skyscraper that housed his private equity firm. I leaned into my fabricated role of the declining, pathetic old man. I shuffled up to the dismissive receptionist and stammered that I had accidentally left my expensive prescription reading glasses in my son's office during my clumsy visit a few days prior. She rolled her eyes, annoyed by my apparent senility, and reluctantly buzzed me through the security doors. Jason was thankfully out of the office, attending a supposed client lunch. His assistant let me inside his massive corner suite and stood by the door watching me. I dropped to my knees, pretending to search the thick carpet. I crawled under the large wooden desk, my heart hammering violently. With one swift, practiced motion, I reached up behind the modesty panel, peeled the tiny recording device off the wood, and slipped it seamlessly into my shirt pocket. I stood up, produced a spare pair of glasses from my sleeve, smiled a wide, foolish smile at the assistant, and shuffled out of the building. I did not drive home. I drove my old Ford truck out to the abandoned industrial docks by the river. It was a desolate, forgotten stretch of concrete that was completely empty at this time of day. I parked facing the gray, turbulent water, turned off the engine, and locked the doors. The cab of the truck was freezing, but I did not turn on the heater. I needed the bitter cold to keep my mind sharp. I pulled a small, battered laptop from my duffel bag, booted it up, and plugged the tiny recording device into the side port. My hands were shaking so violently that it took me 3 attempts to properly connect the small wire. A file directory popped up on the bright screen showing dozens of audio clips recorded over the past few days. I took a deep, steadying breath, closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, and double-clicked on the longest audio file in the folder. At first there was nothing but the muffled ambient noise of the corporate office. I could hear the faint clicking of a computer keyboard and the distant hum of the city traffic. But then the heavy office door clicked open. The sharp, unmistakable sound of Victoria's high heels echoed across the hardwood floor. I sat perfectly still in the freezing cab of my truck, turning the volume dial all the way up. Victoria did not offer a sweet, loving greeting. Her voice was sharp, irritated, and entirely devoid of the syrupy warmth she always used around me. "Jason," she snapped, her tone dripping with pure venom. "My credit card was just declined at the jewelry boutique." "What is going on? I thought you said the cash flow problem was temporarily handled." I heard the sound of a heavy chair scraping aggressively against the floor as Jason stood up. "Handled," he hissed back, his voice vibrating with a terrifying, barely contained rage. "Nothing is handled, Victoria. The entire fund is completely bleeding out. Those investors from the South Side are breathing down my neck, demanding their quarterly dividends by the end of the month, and I do not have the capital to pay them. I gave you strict instructions to stop your ridiculous luxury spending until the massive payout finally clears." Victoria scoffed loudly, clearly unfazed by his anger. "Well, when exactly is that going to happen?" she demanded. "You promised me we would be entirely clear of this miserable situation by Christmas. You said the problem was permanently solved. What followed was a conversation so deeply evil, so fundamentally monstrous, that it completely shattered whatever tiny lingering fraction of hope I still held onto for my son." Jason slammed his fist against the desk, the impact causing the audio to aggressively peak and crackle in my truck speakers. "How is it my fault that the professional contractor I hired completely botched the job?" he screamed, his voice completely unhinged. "I wired $200,000 of the old man's cash to that firm in the Cayman Islands. I paid them exactly what they asked for to make sure she never came back. They swore they had the best people. They swore it would look like a tragic, unavoidable car accident on that wet coastal highway." I stopped breathing. The air in my lungs turned to solid ice. There it was, the absolute undeniable confession. Jason had used my life savings to hire a hitman. The audio continued to play, completely indifferent to the devastating effect it was having on my soul. Victoria sighed heavily, sounding more inconvenienced than horrified by the discussion of a brutal assassination. "Well, they clearly failed, Jason," she said coldly. "They ran her car off the embankment, but there was no body in the wreckage. She crawled out of that ravine and vanished. She is out there somewhere, and if she goes to the police and tells them you were threatening her, everything we built is entirely finished. We will both end up in federal prison. She will not go to the authorities." Jason snapped back, his voice dripping with arrogant, sinister confidence. "She is entirely too terrified. I made sure she believed the men chasing her were violent loan sharks coming to collect my supposed gambling debts. She thinks the mob is after her. She will stay completely hidden in whatever dark, miserable hole she crawled into right now." I turned off the audio recording and wiped away a single cold tear. My son was going to pay for every single unforgivable sin. I sat in the freezing silence of my truck for what felt like hours. My hand hovered over the keyboard of the battered laptop. I had turned the audio off because the sheer horror of hearing my son casually discuss a contracted murder was almost too much for my old heart to bear. But I knew I could not stop now. I had to know the full extent of the darkness. I had to understand the exact mechanics of his twisted plan. I reached out with a trembling finger and pressed the spacebar. The audio hissed back to life, filling the cramped cab of my truck with the chilling voices of Jason and Victoria. The argument in the office had not ended. It had merely shifted to a new, even more terrifying topic. Victoria's voice cut through the static, sounding increasingly agitated. "I do not care if she is hiding in a hole, Jason," she snapped. "The fact remains that we do not have a physical body, and without a physical body, the insurance company is completely stonewalling us. They are demanding proof of death before they release a single dime of that money." I leaned closer to the speakers, my breath catching in my throat. Insurance company. I suddenly remembered the thick, heavy manila folder I had found hidden at the very bottom of Jason's desk drawer. The file with the logo of the massive high-risk life insurance conglomerate. Jason let out a long, frustrated breath. "I am fully aware of the corporate protocols, Victoria," he replied, his voice tight with barely contained stress. but the policy is completely ironclad. I made sure of it. I took out that comprehensive $5 million policy on her life 8 months ago. I paid the exorbitant premiums in cash, so she would never see the paper trail on our joint bank statements. It is a flawless policy. $5 million. The words echoed in my mind, ringing with a sickening clarity. The final puzzle piece locked violently into place. Jason did not just want his wife gone so he could freely flaunt his relationship with Victoria. He did not simply want a divorce. A divorce would have meant splitting his remaining assets and exposing his massive financial fraud during the legal discovery process. No, Jason needed Emily dead for a very specific, highly lucrative reason. He needed her to be the ultimate sacrificial lamb to save his collapsing empire. The audio continued to roll, painting a picture of pure, unadulterated evil. Jason began pacing across the hardwood floor of his office. "You know exactly why we needed that specific payout," he muttered bitterly. "The Ponzi fund was bleeding $4 million. Those Southside investors were threatening to burn my house to the ground with us inside it. The $5 million death benefit was the absolute perfect solution. It would completely cover the massive deficit, pay off the dangerous clients, and leave us with a clean $1 million to finally start our new life. Emily was supposed to die on that coastal highway. The insurance company would have ruled it a tragic accidental death. The money would have been wired to my account within 30 days. It was supposed to be a completely clean slate for us." I closed my eyes, feeling a profound, crushing sorrow for the young woman I had seen shivering in that roadside diner. Emily had spent the last 7 months believing she was running from violent loan sharks. She believed she was protecting her unborn child from ruthless mobsters. She had absolutely no idea that the only monster hunting her was the man she had married. She was completely unaware that a $5 million bounty had been secretly placed on her head. Victoria's high heels clicked sharply against the floor as she apparently stood up to confront him. "But it was not a clean slate, Jason," she argued coldly. "The hitman failed. She survived the crash and ran away. And now we are sitting on a $5 million policy that we cannot even cash out because you cannot produce a death certificate. Those investors are not going to wait forever." "I have my best corporate lawyers working on it around the clock," Jason fired back, his tone defensive and desperate. "We are filing the emergency motions this week. Because she left that fake confession note, I forced her to write. And because there has been absolutely no banking activity or physical trace of her for over half a year, my legal team is building a massive circumstantial case. We are aggressively petitioning the state judge to declare her legally dead in absentia. A declaration of death in absentia." My stomach violently churned at the sheer audacity of his legal strategy. Since his hired assassin failed to produce a physical corpse, Jason was using the very legal system itself to finish the job. He was actively manipulating the courts, presenting himself as the tragic abandoned husband, all to convince a judge to legally erase his pregnant wife from existence. Once the judge signed that piece of paper, the life insurance company would be legally obligated to pay out the massive $5 million settlement. Jason would get his blood money, pay off his furious Ponzi investors, and walk away completely unscathed. It will take at least another month to get the judge to sign the final declaration. Jason continued, his voice dropping to a low, sinister murmur. "We just have to keep the old man completely oblivious until then. We will bleed his farmhouse dry if we have to." I reached out with a shaking hand and slowly shut the glowing laptop screen. I sat in the absolute darkness of my vehicle, listening to the heavy rain beginning to fall violently against the metal roof. The evidence was perfect. I possessed absolutely everything I needed to completely obliterate his entire existence. He was going to suffer forever. The final trap was set. I sat in the absolute darkness of my vehicle, listening to the heavy rain beginning to fall violently against the metal roof. I had closed the laptop, believing I had heard the absolute worst of it. I thought my heart could not possibly break any further, but the suffocating silence inside the cab of my truck felt even heavier than the terrifying audio recording. I knew I could not simply walk away with half the truth. If I was going to destroy the monster my son had become, I needed to know every single detail of the darkness he had constructed. I reached out with a trembling hand, lifted the glowing screen of the battered laptop, and pressed the spacebar to resume the playback. The audio hissed back to life. The argument between Jason and Victoria had not ended with the horrifying revelation of the $5 million life insurance policy. Victoria was still pacing the hardwood floor of the downtown office, her high heels clicking aggressively against the wood. She sounded incredibly agitated, her voice rising in a shrill panic. "The life insurance payout is still a month away, Jason," she snapped sharply. "What are we supposed to do right now? The contractors working on the house remodel are demanding their next payment by Friday. My credit cards are completely maxed out. We do not have the immediate cash flow to survive another 4 weeks of waiting for a judge to declare Emily legally dead. Those Southside investors have been calling your personal cell phone all morning. They are not going to wait for a court order. They are going to show up at our front door and drag us both out into the street." I heard the sound of liquid being poured into a heavy crystal glass. Jason was pouring himself a drink right in the middle of the afternoon. "Relax, Victoria," he said smoothly, his voice completely devoid of the panic she was feeling. "I told you I have every single angle perfectly calculated. The insurance money is the final permanent solution, but we have a very lucrative bridge loan sitting right in front of us. We just need to legally extract it." Victoria stopped pacing. "What are you talking about?" she demanded. "We have absolutely zero assets left to leverage. Every property we own is leveraged to the absolute limit." Jason let out a dark, arrogant chuckle that made the bile rise in my throat. "We do not have any assets," he corrected her softly. "But my father does." The recording picked up the sound of Jason walking slowly across the room, the ice clinking against the sides of his glass. "Just be patient, Victoria," he murmured. "Have you not noticed how rapidly the old man's mind is going lately? He can barely remember where he leaves his own keys. He spilled burning hot coffee all over my desk just a few days ago. He is completely falling apart. It is actually incredibly sad to watch. I sat perfectly still in my freezing truck, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. He was talking about my fabricated performance, my intentional clumsiness, my feigned forgetfulness. He had completely bought the pathetic illusion I had carefully fed him." Jason's voice dropped into a low, conspiratorial whisper. "My private lawyer has the medical proxy documents completely drafted and ready to file. We are submitting the emergency paperwork to the state health board next week. We are going to have a private physician declare him legally unfit to manage his own affairs due to severe advancing dementia. Once the judge grants me full conservatorship over his estate, I am seizing the farmhouse." Victoria let out a soft, delighted gasp. The farmhouse, she repeated, the greed practically dripping from her words. Jason took a slow sip of his drink. "Exactly," he confirmed. "The property is sitting on 40 acres of prime commercial real estate. I already have a handshake agreement with a massive corporate developer. The second I have legal control of his assets, we bulldoze that miserable old house to the ground and sell the dirt for $3 million in pure cash. It will be more than enough to hold off the angry investors and keep us living comfortably until Emily's death certificate is finalized and the $5 million policy pays out. We just have to put the old man in a cheap state-run nursing facility and take what is rightfully mine." The audio file finally ended, completely cutting off into a sharp burst of static before fading to absolute silence. I did not move. I did not breathe. I just stared blindly through the rain-streaked windshield of my truck. A strange, profound transformation happened inside my body in that exact moment. The deep, agonizing sorrow that had been crushing my chest for the past 24 hours completely evaporated. The tears I had been holding back instantly dried up. The grieving, heartbroken father who had desperately wanted to believe there was still some shred of humanity left in his son simply ceased to exist. He died in the freezing cab of that truck, murdered by the recorded words of his own flesh and blood. In his place, something entirely new was born. It was a cold, calculated mechanical fury. It was a terrifying absolute clarity. Jason had planned to hire a corrupt doctor, lock me away in a miserable institution, and pave over the very land my late wife had loved more than life itself. He was going to use my home, my sanctuary, as a cheap pawn to fund his blood money. He had underestimated me. He had looked at a man who spent 40 years breaking his back on construction sites and assumed he was dealing with a weak, foolish old victim. He was wrong. I was not going to cry anymore. I was going to systematically dismantle his entire life. I was going to burn his beautiful, arrogant world straight to the ground, and I was going to watch him lose absolutely everything he valued. I did not go home to sleep that night. I sat in my truck by the river until the dark sky slowly turned a pale, bruised shade of morning gray. The rain had stopped, leaving the city air thick and heavy with fog. I started the engine and drove straight to the rundown commercial district on the south side. I parked outside the dingy office building just as the sun began to peek over the horizon. I walked up the creaking wooden stairs and knocked heavily on the frosted glass door of Bradley Mitchell's office. He opened the door, holding a steaming mug of black coffee, looking exactly like a man who had not slept in 3 days. He took one look at my face, saw the absolute coldness in my eyes, and silently stepped aside to let me in. I walked over to his battered metal desk, unzipped my duffel bag, and placed the battered laptop and the tiny recording device directly in front of him. I told him to listen to the final file. I sat in the hard wooden chair and watched his expression as the audio played. I watched the cynical, hardened fraud investigator slowly lower his coffee mug. I watched his jaw clench tightly as Jason calmly detailed the hired assassination, the $5 million life insurance fraud, and the plot to legally steal my farmhouse by locking me in a psychiatric ward. When the recording finally ended, Bradley sat completely motionless for a long time. He ran a rough hand over his face and let out a long, heavy breath. He looked across the desk at me, his gray eyes filled with a terrifying, serious intensity. "William," he said quietly, "have investigated arsonists, organized crime syndicates, and corporate psychopaths for 30 years. Your son is entirely in a league of his own. This is no longer a simple fraud investigation. Hiring a professional assassin across state lines is a massive federal crime. Wire fraud, money laundering, and attempting to defraud a national life insurance conglomerate are massive federal crimes. We cannot handle this ourselves anymore. We have to bring the government into the room right now." I nodded my head once my face completely devoid of emotion. I told him to make the call. Bradley picked up his desk phone, dialed a secure number, and spoke briefly in a low, hushed voice. He hung up the receiver and told me we were not leaving the office. 2 hours later, the heavy frosted glass door swung open. 2 men walked into the cramped room. They were dressed in sharp, unassuming dark suits, projecting an aura of absolute authority. They introduced themselves as special agents with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, specifically attached to the Financial Crimes and Organized Crime Task Force. They sat down across from me, their expressions completely unreadable. Bradley played the audio recording for them. He laid out the Cayman Islands wire transfer documents, the evidence of the $4 million Ponzi scheme, and the details of the $5 million insurance policy. The agents listened intently, taking meticulous notes on small yellow pads. When the presentation was over, the older of the 2 agents, a man with steel-gray hair and piercing blue eyes, leaned forward and rested his hands on the desk. "Mr. Stanton," the agent began, his voice calm and methodical. "The evidence your investigator has compiled is incredibly substantial. However, building an airtight federal indictment that guarantees your son goes away for the rest of his life requires absolutely undeniable proof of intent. Defense attorneys are incredibly ruthless. They could argue that the audio recording was simply a hypothetical discussion, or that he was exaggerating under the stress of his failing business. To secure a federal warrant that completely freezes his assets and puts him behind bars with absolutely zero chance of bail, we need him to definitively link himself to the crimes in a way he cannot legally deny. We need him to publicly admit to the insurance fraud, or we need him to physically sign documents that directly connect him to the offshore accounts and the fraudulent seizure of your farmhouse while acknowledging the Ponzi scheme. The agent looked at me with a profound sympathy. We can arrest him right now based on the tapes, but it will be a long, brutal legal battle, and he might find a way to slip through the cracks. If we want to completely destroy his organization, we need him to willingly step right into a trap. I looked at the federal agent. I did not blink. I did not hesitate. The cold, mechanical fury inside my chest had completely solidified into an unbreakable resolve. I leaned forward, resting my calloused hands on the metal desk. "Give me 48 hours, I said, my voice completely steady and terrifyingly calm. "Give me 2 days, and I will hand him to you on a silver platter." The agent raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by my absolute confidence. "What exactly are you planning to do?" he asked. I looked at Bradley, then back at the agents. "My son believes I am a pathetic, declining old man," I explained smoothly. "He believes I am entirely incapable of protecting myself. He wants my farmhouse to save his collapsing empire. So I am going to give it to him. I am going to host a massive, luxurious dinner party at the most expensive hotel in the city. I am going to invite Jason Victoria and every single one of his angry, defrauded investors. I am going to tell him that my mind is failing, and I want to publicly sign over my entire estate to his company to protect my legacy. He is so arrogant and so desperate for that money that he will walk right into the room and sign the documents in front of everyone." The agent stared at me, a slow nod of understanding forming. "And when he signs the papers," the agent asked softly. I offered a smile that held absolutely no warmth. "When he signs the papers," I replied, "I am going to show his furious investors exactly where their money really went. I am going to expose his entire life. I am going to give you your public confession, and I am going to give my son exactly what he deserves." I walked out of that dingy office with a heart made of absolute stone. The federal agents had given me their blessing, and the 48-hour countdown had officially begun. I drove straight back to my empty house, sat down in my worn leather armchair, and stared at the telephone resting on the side table. This was going to be the most important performance of my entire life. I had to convince a highly intelligent, paranoid psychopath that he had completely won. I picked up the receiver, took a deep breath, and dialed Jason's private cell phone number. He answered on the third ring, his voice clipping with obvious annoyance. He barked my name, asking what I wanted in the middle of his busy workday. I immediately softened my voice, adding a slight pathetic tremor to my words. I told him I was frightened. I fabricated a story about driving to the grocery store and suddenly forgetting how to get back home. I told him I had sat in the parking lot for 2 hours crying, unable to remember my own street address. The line went completely quiet for a moment. When Jason finally spoke, the annoyance was entirely gone, replaced by a thick, sickeningly sweet tone of manufactured sympathy. He told me to calm down, assuring me that everything was going to be fine. I pushed the lie even further. I let out a heavy, defeated sigh and told him that I had been doing a lot of difficult thinking. I confessed that my mind was slipping much faster than I had realized, and the burden of managing my finances and the large farmhouse was becoming entirely too much for me to handle. I told him I wanted to protect my legacy before I lost my faculties completely. I said I wanted to officially sign the deed to the farmhouse directly over to his corporate holding company. I could practically hear the greedy smile spreading across his face through the phone. He was undoubtedly thinking about how incredibly easy this was going to be. He would not even need to wait for a judge to declare me incompetent. I was simply handing him a $3 million asset on a silver platter. He eagerly agreed, offering to bring his lawyers to my house that very evening. But I stopped him. I told him I wanted to do things my way. I wanted to make it a formal, dignified occasion. I instructed him to invite Victoria and his top 20 most important investors to a private, lavish dinner at the Grand Plaza Hotel in downtown Chicago. I told him I wanted to publicly demonstrate my absolute faith in his business by transferring my greatest asset to his fund in front of his most valued clients. I knew that the promise of a public multi-million-dollar capital injection would be the perfect bait. It would give him exactly what he needed to temporarily pacify the angry, dangerous investors who were threatening his life. Jason swallowed the bait completely whole. He promised me he would organize the guest list immediately and told me how incredibly proud he was of my wise decision. The next 2 days were a blur of absolute, calculated precision. While Jason excitedly sent out elegant invitations to the very people he had stolen millions from, I was working directly with Bradley and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I withdrew a large sum of cash from my remaining savings and personally booked the most opulent private banquet hall at the Grand Plaza Hotel. The room featured towering floor-to-ceiling windows, heavy velvet drapes, and massive crystal chandeliers. It was the perfect stage for an execution. The federal agents moved in hours before the event. They disguised themselves as hotel catering staff and audio-visual technicians. They meticulously installed microscopic high-definition cameras in the ornate floral centerpieces on the tables. They wired the podium microphone directly into a secure federal recording server parked in a surveillance van 2 blocks away. Every single square inch of that banquet hall was covered. On the evening of the dinner, I stood in front of the hallway mirror in my quiet house. I carefully dressed myself in an oversized, slightly wrinkled suit to enhance the illusion of a frail, shrinking old man. I practiced my vacant, confused stare. But behind my tired eyes, the fierce, protective father was wide awake. I thought about Emily hiding in the shadows with my unborn grandchild. I thought about the professional assassin my son had paid for with my retirement funds. I buttoned my jacket, grabbed my walking cane, and walked out the door. I was ready to bring the entire glittering ceiling crashing down on his head. When I arrived at the Grand Plaza Hotel, the private banquet room was already buzzing with quiet, tense energy. The 20 investors Jason had invited were dressed in expensive, tailored suits and designer dresses, but their faces betrayed a deep, simmering anxiety. These were the wealthy, dangerous individuals who had been demanding their stolen money. They were only here because Jason had promised them a massive financial reassurance. Jason and Victoria were working the room holding crystal glasses of champagne, practically glowing with arrogant triumph. Victoria was wearing a stunning, backless silk gown, her massive diamond ring catching the light from the chandeliers as she laughed and touched the arms of the tense investors. When Jason saw me slowly shuffling through the heavy mahogany double doors, leaning heavily on my wooden cane, he immediately rushed over. He wrapped his arm around my fragile shoulders, guiding me to the head table with a disgusting display of public affection. The dinner service began. Waiters in crisp white uniforms, who I knew were heavily armed federal agents, moved silently around the room, serving courses of roasted duck and imported caviar. The atmosphere slowly began to thaw as the expensive wine flowed. Jason was completely in his element, a master manipulator spinning a web of comfort and luxury. As the plates from the main course were finally cleared away, Jason stood up from his chair. He tapped a silver spoon against his crystal champagne flute, the sharp ringing sound demanding the attention of the entire room. The conversations immediately died down. All eyes turned toward the polished wooden podium at the front of the room. Jason walked up to the microphone, adjusting his expensive silk tie, and looked out over the crowd with a deeply practiced, somber expression. "Thank you all for being here tonight." Jason began, his voice projecting a perfect blend of professional confidence and fabricated emotional vulnerability. "We have faced some challenging market fluctuations over the past few months, and I know many of you have expressed concerns about the liquidity of our fund. But I brought you here tonight to prove that our foundation is absolutely unbreakable." He paused, turning his gaze toward me. He offered me a sad, loving smile. As many of you know, my father William has been battling some severe health issues recently. His mind is sadly not what it used to be, but in his incredible wisdom, he has decided to step away from managing his own affairs. Tonight, he is legally transferring the deed to his 40-acre commercial property, an asset valued at over $3 million, directly into our corporate holding fund. This massive capital injection will guarantee our upcoming quarterly dividends and secure our mutual prosperity for years to come. The room erupted into polite, relieved applause. The tense investors finally relaxed their greedy eyes, reflecting the promise of fresh money. Victoria beamed from the front table, raising her glass in a silent toast. Jason gestured warmly for me to join him at the podium. "Come on up here, Dad," he coaxed gently. "Let us make it official." The federal agent, disguised as a waiter, had already placed the heavy legal documents and a gold pen perfectly on the podium. I stood up slowly. I let my hands shake visibly. I grasped my wooden cane and shuffled toward the front of the room, playing the pathetic, broken old man for the very last time. The applause continued as I reached the podium. Jason patted my back patronizingly and stepped slightly to the side, giving me the microphone. I looked down at the legal documents. They were exactly as Jason had promised, completely signing away my entire life to his fraudulent company. I picked up the gold pen. My hand hovered over the signature line. The entire room held its collective breath, waiting for the millions of dollars to be legally secured. But I did not sign. I placed the gold pen down on the polished wood. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, feeling the absolute power of the moment wash over me. I let go of my wooden cane. It clattered loudly against the floor, causing several people in the front row to jump. I did not reach down to pick it up. Instead, my posture completely changed. The deliberate slump in my shoulders vanished. I stood up tall, straight, and imposing. The frail, confused old man completely dissolved, revealing the hardened, furious contractor who had spent 40 years breaking his back to build a life. I grabbed the microphone, gripping it tightly. When I spoke, the wavering, pathetic tremor in my voice was entirely gone. My tone was like a razor blade cutting through the heavy silence of the banquet hall. It was loud, commanding, and absolutely terrifying. "I brought you all here to talk about investments," I said, staring directly into the eyes of the stunned crowd. The investors exchanged highly confused glances. Jason took a hesitant step toward me, a flash of genuine panic finally crossing his arrogant face. "Dad," he whispered urgently, trying to reach for the microphone. "What are you doing? Just sign the papers." I ignored him completely. I locked eyes with the most dangerous-looking investor in the room. "I brought you all here to talk about investments," I repeated, my voice echoing off the high ceilings. "But we are not going to talk about real estate. We are not going to talk about my farmhouse. We are going to talk about where your $4 million actually went. And specifically, we are going to talk about a secret $5 million life insurance policy." The color instantly drained from Jason's face. He stumbled backward, his mouth falling open in sheer, absolute horror. The trap had just slammed shut. The trap had just slammed shut. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a small remote control. I did not break eye contact with my son as my thumb pressed down firmly on the single button. Instantly, the soft background music playing through the hotel's sound system completely cut out. It was immediately replaced by a sharp burst of static that made everyone in the massive room flinch. And then Jason's own voice echoed off the crystal chandeliers and the heavy velvet drapes. It was the exact recording from his downtown corner office. The audio was crystal clear, completely filling the banquet hall with the undeniable sound of pure evil. The recorded voice of my son angrily screamed about the massive $4 million deficit in his Ponzi fund. He screamed about the dangerous South Side investors breathing down his neck, demanding their money. And then came the absolute killing blow. The recorded voice of Victoria complained about the botched job and Jason roared back, confessing to wiring $200,000 to a shadow company in the Cayman Islands to hire a professional hitman to murder his pregnant wife. The entire room froze in paralyzing shock. The clinking of expensive silverware stopped completely. The waiters stood perfectly still in the shadows. For 10 agonizing seconds, the only sound was the echoing audio of Jason, detailing the $5 million life insurance fraud and his plot to lock his own father in a psychiatric ward just to steal a farmhouse. As the recording faded into silence, the collective realization hit the room like a physical shockwave. The investors, the wealthy men and women who had just been celebrating their guaranteed returns, suddenly understood the horrifying truth. They were not at a corporate celebration. They were standing at an active crime scene, and their money was completely irrevocably gone. The silence shattered into terrifying chaos. A massive man sitting nearest the podium leaped to his feet, his chair crashing backward onto the thick carpet. He let out a deep roar of pure fury and violently lunged toward the head table. Jason stumbled backward, his hands raised defensively, his eyes wide with blind panic. He desperately tried to scream that it was a fake recording, an elaborate deepfake designed by a confused old man, but his voice completely cracked, and the naked terror radiating from his sweating face betrayed his overwhelming guilt. The investors began loudly shouting aggressively, demanding their stolen money, openly threatening his life right there in the luxury hotel. Several large men began advancing toward the podium, their fists clenched, ready to tear my son apart with their bare hands. Before the angry mob could reach him, a loud, commanding voice boomed from the back of the banquet hall. "Federal agents, nobody move." The heavy double doors at the entrance violently swung open, crashing loudly against the walls. The waiters in the crisp white uniforms simultaneously drew their concealed weapons instantly, taking complete control of the chaotic room. The advancing investors froze in their tracks, slowly throwing their hands in the air as gold badges flashed under the bright chandelier light. But Jason was not looking at the guns, and he was not looking at the federal agents. He was staring straight down the center aisle, his face completely devoid of color, looking exactly like a man who had just seen a ghost. Walking slowly through the open doors, flanked by the lead investigator, and Bradley Mitchell, was Emily. She was wearing a simple, clean cotton dress. Her pregnant belly was prominent, holding the unborn child that Jason had paid an assassin to destroy. She looked directly at her husband, her face completely pale, but her posture entirely unbroken. Jason let out a strangled, pathetic gasp. His knees completely buckled beneath him. He collapsed onto the polished wooden floor, shivering violently, completely unable to process the impossible sight of his murdered wife walking calmly into the room. He desperately scrambled backward like a cornered animal, hitting his back against the velvet drapes. At the head table, Victoria finally broke from her paralyzed state. The cold predator fully realized that her luxurious stolen empire was entirely finished. She dropped her crystal champagne flute, lifted the skirt of her expensive silk gown, and sprinted frantically toward the side kitchen exit. But she did not even make it 5 steps. 2 female agents stepped out from behind a wooden partition, grabbed her arms, and violently slammed her face down against a table covered in expensive caviar. The sharp metallic sound of heavy handcuffs ratcheting tightly around Victoria's wrists echoed loudly over the shouting crowd. She screamed and cursed, thrashing wildly against the agents, but they dragged her forcefully to her feet and marched her roughly out of the room. I stepped slowly down from the podium, leaving the unsigned legal documents resting peacefully on the polished wood. The room naturally parted for me. The angry investors, the armed federal agents, even Emily and Bradley, watched in absolute unbroken silence as I walked toward the dark corner where my son was cowering on the floor. Jason looked up at me, hot tears streaming down his face, his chest heaving with desperate, shallow sobs. "Dad," he choked out, reaching a trembling hand toward my worn leather shoe. "Dad, please, listen. You have to help me. I am your son." I looked down at the miserable, broken creature sweating on the hotel carpet. I felt absolutely nothing inside my chest. No pity, no sorrow, no lingering paternal love. I reached into my trousers, pulled out my wallet, and extracted a single crumpled green $1 bill. I slowly let it flutter down. It landed gently on the floor, right next to his trembling hand. I looked him dead in the eyes, my voice colder than the winter wind blowing off the lake. "That is your inheritance," I said quietly, making sure he heard every single syllable. "Enjoy your new life in federal prison." I turned my back on him and walked out of that opulent banquet hall, leaving the shattered remains of his fraudulent empire in the hands of the authorities. I did not look back. The agonizing nightmare was finally over. The air outside the hotel felt crisp and clean, washing away the suffocating stench of his deception. The swift and brutal justice that followed was heavily documented by every major news outlet in the city. Jason and Victoria were denied bail. The mountain of federal evidence Bradley and the agents compiled against them was absolutely insurmountable. They tried to turn on each other during the preliminary hearings, pointing fingers like the cowards they truly were, but the audio recordings and the paper trails sealed their fate. Jason was convicted on multiple federal charges, including wire fraud, conspiracy to commit murder, and insurance fraud. He was sentenced to 25 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. Victoria, desperate to save herself, attempted to negotiate a plea deal, but the judge showed her absolutely no mercy. She received 15 years for her active role in the financial conspiracy. Their sprawling mansion was seized by the government, liquidated to partially repay the furious investors they had ruthlessly defrauded. Every single physical trace of their luxurious stolen life was erased from the world. It has been exactly 6 months since that dramatic night at the Grand Plaza Hotel. I am sitting on the wide wooden porch of my farmhouse, watching the golden afternoon sun slowly dip behind the ancient oak trees. The property is quiet, peaceful, and absolutely secure. It is the exact sanctuary my late wife Martha always intended it to be. I am gently rocking a wooden chair, looking down at the small, perfect bundle resting in my arms. My newborn grandson. He has a shock of dark hair and bright, curious eyes that take in the world with absolute innocence. He will never know the darkness his father tried to bring into his life. He will never know the feeling of being hunted or discarded for financial gain. He will grow up surrounded by rolling green hills, fresh air, and unconditional love. Emily is inside the house right now, humming softly as she prepares dinner in the large country kitchen. She is safe, protected, and finally beginning to heal from the profound trauma she endured. The dark circles under her eyes have completely vanished, replaced by the radiant glow of a mother who knows her child is secure. We have formed a beautiful, unbreakable bond. I legally adopted her as my own daughter, ensuring that she and her beautiful son will inherit everything I own when my time finally comes. Sitting in the quiet twilight, listening to the soft breathing of my sleeping grandson, I have reflected on the bitter lessons I learned. When you spend your life building a foundation for your children, you assume blood is the strongest bond. You believe your sacrifices will be honored with basic respect. But I learned the hard way that blood means nothing if it is not matched by character. True family is not a matter of genetics. True family is built entirely on mutual trust, unwavering respect, and selfless love. Emily is not my biological daughter, but she has shown me more grace and genuine affection than the son I raised from birth. Jason possessed my name but none of my values. He looked at an aging father and saw a vulnerable target. He believed my quiet demeanor and patience were signs of mental decline and physical weakness. That was his fatal miscalculation. He forgot that men of my generation were built with steel and hardened by brutal labor. I want my story to serve as a warning to anyone who thinks they can manipulate the elderly people in their lives. Never mistake an old man's silence for ignorance. Never mistake our patience for submission. And never mistake our unconditional kindness for weakness. We have survived decades of hardship, and if you push us into a corner to protect the people we love, we will tear your world apart with a cold precision you will never see coming. As the evening shadows stretch across the lawn and the first stars appear in the sky, I feel a profound peace settle over my heart. The painful wounds of betrayal will always leave a scar, but those scars are simply a reminder of the incredible strength it took to survive. I protected my family, I defended my home, and I secured a beautiful, bright future for the next generation. That is the only legacy that truly matters. I want to take a moment to sincerely thank every single one of you for taking the time to listen to my long and difficult journey. Sharing this dark chapter of my life has been incredibly cathartic for me, and I hope it has provided you with some valuable perspective on your own relationships. If you found my story compelling, or if you have ever had to fiercely stand up to a toxic family member who severely underestimated your strength and your intelligence, please share your experiences in the comments section down below. I read every single message, and I draw immense strength from the incredible community we are building here together. Please make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss an update. Your continued support allows me to keep sharing these deeply personal, powerful life stories with the world. Take a look at the screen right now to see the next incredible video I have personally selected for you to watch. Until we meet again in the next story, please remember to hold your true loved ones close. Always trust your deepest instincts, and never allow anyone to strip away your hard-earned dignity. With my deepest love and my utmost respect, thank you for watching, and please take care of yourselves.